bienvenidos. Welcome to our third seminar in the 2022 speaker series. We're doing it in English this time just to see how that goes. I think this topic especially is going to be very interesting to California researchers in this area of land use planning. So I thought this one in English would be useful. The first two speakers in this series are available on our YouTube channel, which now has a custom URL, youtube.com/c/UCLA Ciudades. So all the other talks from last year as well are there. Very interesting. Next week, in 2 weeks, we'll hear from Jorge Montejano Escamilla and Laura Janca, who made the Plan de Ordenamiento Territorial for Mexico City. And they'll talk about that experience, which is going to be very interesting. But today I'm excited to welcome Diego Gil and Andrea Herrera, as well as others from their research team from the Pontificia Universidad Católica de Chile, La Católica. And they're going to talk about the research on land use regulations in Santiago. So you might know that Santiago is one of the most discussed and debated cities when it comes to land use reform. The most discussed and debated city probably in Latin America on this topic with the upzoning. A lot of differing opinions on the results of those reforms. So I'll be curious to hear their discussion and policy implications as well. Diego is an assistant professor at this cool school that I was hearing about that's created by several different parts of the University of Católica, the School of Government. He got his degrees from Stanford and has written a number of cool papers on housing policy and segregation. I'm really glad to meet him today, and I was looking at your work, and I recommend other people check out your Google Scholar links. And Andrea is a researcher on Diego's team at the Católica, and she has a master's degree in economics with a specialization in public policy, and I hear we'll be starting a PhD program somewhere next year. Thank you both so much for participating in the series. I'm really looking forward to the presentation, and we'll have a nice discussion afterwards. So take it away.
Great. Thank you very much. Thanks to all for joining the session. Special thanks to Pablo for organizing this wonderful speaker series and for inviting us to share with you our research. It's a great opportunity for us that we're investigating land use and housing issues to connect with a network of academics and policymakers that are interested in this area. So that's great. I also see my old PhD classmate in the Zoom link, Fernan. So I'm also grateful that he's here. You mentioned Andrea. She's one of the co-authors of this piece. Here we also have Hugo Silva, who's a professor of economics and engineering here at the Universidad Católica, who's also a co-author. And we also have Javier Peñafiel here. He's one of our greatest MPP graduates from the School of Government, and actually the research that I'm going to show today was part of his master thesis. It grew from his master thesis. So I'm going to share some slides. I hope I can. I think you need to allow me to share my screen.
Yeah, sorry about that. Yeah, you have the power.
Great. Yeah, okay. Let me see if I can. Can you see my slides there?
Yep, looks good.
Okay, great. 1 second, I need to organize a bit my screen. Okay, now I can see everyone and also see that. Okay, so the title of the paper is The Social Divide of Land Use Regulatory Changes, Evidence from Chile. The motivation of our study comes from what today represents, I think, a wide academic consensus in the economic literature that associates strict local land use controls with this phenomenon that we are seeing in many metropolitan areas around the world related to an increase in housing prices. So one of the explanation of this important trend towards an increase in housing prices in many cities around the world is the fact that many local municipalities are imposing strict local land use regulations, so they limit the supply of housing, which has in turn an effect on housing prices. There's been several studies on the impact of strict local land use controls. It's been suggested that it has a negative effect on economic development, on income segregation, and even on carbon emissions. So today, I think land use regimes are the center of an important discussion in urban and housing policy, and are part of the discussion of the affordability crisis that we are seeing in many vibrant cities around the world. So there's been also when facing this discussion about local land use controls, there's been a theoretical and academic discussion about the different factors that are associated with the way cities are regulated. Until recently, the sort of conventional wisdom was that local land use regulations responded more heavily to the influence of the real estate industry. That's the term coined by Harvey Molotch in a famous sociological paper of the 70s, The Growth Machine Theory. And it was also sort of agreed that in more suburban jurisdictions, the influence of home voters, as was coined by Bill Fischel, was the most relevant actor shaping the way local governments regulated the urban space, right? So in cities, in big cities, in the inner city, the most powerful actor was the real estate industry. In more suburban jurisdictions, the most powerful actor was the home voters, basically. But recent empirical evidence have shown a strong association between home ownership and land use regulations that do not change or become stricter over time, even in metropolitan, in the inner city. So we have the study by Vicky Bean at NYU with a group of collaborators that show that in New York, there's been a trend towards downzoning that is associated with the rate of homeowners living in those neighborhoods. Gabe has a study on LA showing sort of the same relationship between the high presence of homeowners and less likelihood of having upzoning. And Robert Ellickson, a legal scholar from Yale, have shown and described how in many places around the US, the sort of the local land use zoning plans have become sort of frozen over time. There's not been much change. There's also evidence from Massachusetts, from many local jurisdictions in the Boston area, suggesting that old male and long-time homeowners are more likely to participate in planning and zoning boards. And most participants in those meetings tend to oppose the construction of new housing, which again is sort of confirms the hypothesis that in urban areas, home voters are having a big influence in shaping local land use decisions and making land use regulations stricter or frozen over time. Hankinson in a paper suggests something complementary with that finding, in the sense that also renters in big cities sometimes join homeowners in opposing the construction of new housing, right? So there's been several explanations in the law and economics literature on this topic. Schleicher, for instance, argues that local residents have more influence on local decisions because in the US, mostly, land use regimes favor specific land use modifications rather than comprehensive zoning change, right? And at the local level, there is an absence of political leadership and organization. Therefore, the local authorities respond to particular interests that exert pressure over certain neighborhoods. Ellickson argues that individuals may prefer to just keep the neighborhood status quo, especially considering that people give more weight to losses than to gains, which is sort of like a strong finding in the behavioral economics literature. So basically, homeowners prefer to keep the rules as they are rather than allowing processes of upzoning and densification. And it's been also argued that urban factors such as the proximity to transit avenues may counteract the influence of homeowners. These are all hypotheses that we test with data from Santiago. So we see that there's a gap in the literature. Most of the theories and evidence are focused on US metropolitan areas. The US has an institutional context that favors certain decisions on the individual developments rather than the enactment of comprehensive plans. The analysis is centered on the role of homeowners on land use regulatory decisions, and there's no systematic evidence of heterogeneous effects of homeowners' influence. And basically, so income inequality is a defining characteristic of big cities. So we want to see whether urban inequality might be also an important driver behind land use regulatory changes. So our research question is whether there's any association between urban residents' income level and land use regulatory changes. Again, our setting is related to urban inequality. Santiago, actually, the city that where we are getting the data, is an extreme unequal country. You see places like the picture that you see in the left, where there's a really good mixture of different uses, where the quality of life is very high. That happens mostly in the eastern cone of the city, but you also see a very different urban standard in the peripheral areas of Santiago, especially in the south and western side of the city, where there's been the construction of dense housing projects with high poverty concentration and other problematic urban outcomes. So Chile also is a country that has been facing a huge affordability housing crisis, as has happened in other countries. I don't have the time to explain in detail this figure. We can discuss it in the Q&A, but basically there's been a trend where the decline in housing deficit is stuck, and recent data suggests that there's actually has been an increase in the housing deficit, in the number of housing units that the country needs to construct, to build in order to satisfy the housing needs of the middle and low income population. And another problematic trend that we've seen in the country is that the number of informal settlements has been growing over the last decade. And actually, probably given the pandemic and also this social unrest that happened in Chile by the end of 2018, we saw the creation of very important big informal settlements in some urban areas in the country. So our data comes from the greater Santiago area, which is the capital of Chile, a population of 7 million individuals, which has a fragmented governance in 34 municipalities. Most public institutions and private corporations are located in the city. It's a heavily centralized country, and it's a highly unequal and socially segregated metropolitan area, as I show in the picture. We have a very complex and dispersed regulatory context, but basically our land use rules comes from two regulatory instruments: the metropolitan plans, which are plans that are elaborated to regulate things that need the coordination between different municipalities. But most building rules that basically regulate what you can build, come from the local municipal plans. And basically, we created a database that cover 14 municipalities from the Santiago urban area. These are not, except for Lo Barnechea, I would say these are not suburban jurisdictions. These are heavily urban districts. This is in all these districts live around 2 million people. And the variables that we are using for our analysis, the dependent variable is the maximum floor area ratio, the coeficiente de constructibilidad, as we call it in Spanish. Probably everyone here knows what a coeficiente of constructibilidad is. If you have a lot of 100 square meters and the coeficiente of constructibilidad, the floor area ratio is 1, you can build 100 square meters in that lot. And it's basically one of the most important rules that basically establish the limits of what you can construct in a city. Then we have 2 independent variables, which is the home ownership rate. We observe the rate of home ownership in the census block where the lots are located in these 14 municipalities. And we also see the average income of the census block where all the lots in these 14 municipalities are located. And we use as a control variable an indicator that was elaborated by Andrea, Hugo, and Kenzo, who are part of the co-authors of this paper for another paper. This is an accessibility indicator that measures how good is the accessibility of each block in the city related to how close it is to jobs considering commuting times.
Can I ask a question? Sorry, can I ask a question about the FAR? Is there also a rule on the number of units within a specific FAR or not?
Not necessarily from, I don't know if, well, Andrea can complement maybe and Hugo, but not necessarily. There are other like other rules, right? Like you have the height, and you have the density. So the density is another important factor that determines how many units you can construct.
Yeah, so that, I guess maybe if there's a density rate. So if you have an FAR of 1, can you have 3 small units? You know, different separate units.
Depends on the density. Yeah, depends on the density. Yeah.
Depends. Okay. And the FAR data are at the same census block level, or they're at the municipal level?
We have the maximum floor area ratio. I'm going to explain it in a little bit, but for each lot of the 14 municipalities that we're covering in our database. So it's a very disaggregated database. So we have basically, we can observe every lot that is located in the 14 municipalities that comprise our database. And it's a bit difficult to explain our unit of observation because of the following feature. Sometimes, like the norms, because these are sort of modifications that cover several lots at the same time, right? And sometimes these regulatory modifications divide a lot in 2. So basically, our unit of observation is the minimum between the geographical lot and the norm. So if the floor area ratio applies to like two floor ratio applies to the lot, we include in our database two lots. But for the regression, we weighted according to the surface to not alter the results. These are some descriptive statistics of FAR changes. So we observe the changes between 2003 and 2019 for every lot in the 14 municipalities. The areas in yellow are all lots where there was no change between these 2 years. The areas that go from light to strong blue, I don't know if you can, do you see it well? These are areas where there was a down zone from 2003 to 2019, the floor area ratio became stricter. It was reduced. And from light to strong red, it's the opposite, right? There was an upzone. The rule became more flexible. There was an increase in the floor area ratio. This is the same map, but shows the ownership rate. Santiago has a particular characteristic which has a strong home ownership rate, basically because the government has been subsidizing historically the acquisition of property, not rental housing. But in the places that have that are more like light blue has a less ownership rate, stronger blue, more home ownership rate. And this is the typical income stratification map that you see from a city like Santiago. Red, the strongest red shows where the richest decile lives. And then, so most of the map that you see at the right are the areas where the richest people in the city lives. And then to the left, to the western side of the city, there's more mixed income areas. This is our empirical specification. Our dependent variable is a dummy variable. So it's 1 if there was an upzoning in the lot between 2003 and 2019, and 0 if there was no change or there was a downsizing. And then we do the opposite for downzoning. 1 if there was a downzoning, 0 if there was no change or there was an upzone. Then we have our independent variables, and basically the socioeconomic variable measure. It's also a dummy variable. 1 if the lot is located in a census block where the average income is from the richest decile, and 0 if not. And then the ownership rate, it's also a dummy variable where 1 is represent lots where the lot is located in a census block where the average at baseline of the rate of home ownership is above the median of all our sample. And then we have the control variable that measures accessibility. So let me show the final 4 slides with the main regression results. This is the first table show the regression for all developed lots at baseline. Basically, we excluded from the sample all vacant land because it could distort a little bit the results because the political dynamic for vacant land is a little bit different, right? But so they panels 1 and 3 use as dependent variable the dummy variable of downzoning, right? 1 if there was a downzoning, 0 if not, and panels 2 and 4 the opposite, right? Dummy variable 1 if there was an upzoning in the lot, 0 if not. And then we have the independent variable 1 if whether the lot is located in the richest decile, and the ownership independent variable measures whether it's also a binary variable where 1 corresponds to lots that are located in a census block where the home ownership rate is above the median, and 0 if not. And then for panels 1 and 2, we only control for the baseline floor area ratio. And for panels 3 and 4, we control for the baseline floor area ratio and also for the accessibility. So we control for good accessibility of the lot. And well, the main result that I'd like to comment here is the one here. Can you show the mouse? Yeah, can you see now? Yeah. So yeah. Here, basically our main finding is that if the lot is located in a census block where the average income is from the richest decile, there is a decrease in 13% percentage points in the probability of upzoning, right? So it seems that in the richest areas, the local land use regulations are frozen over time. That's sort of the association that we are seeing. Here we sort of restrict the sample, and we only include in the sample all the lots that are located in a census block where the share of single family housing is above median. So we're only seeing basically blocks where there's more houses, not buildings. And here the association is even stronger. So if the lot is located at baseline in a census block where the average income is from the richest decile, over time, it decreases in 37 percentage points the probability of upzoning. Again, they froze. They have frozen the local land use regulations. Then we basically to shed more light on the relationship between home ownership and income status, we divide our sample in panel A and B. Panel A are all lots in the highest income decile, and the panel B is comprised of all the whole sample of the lots that are outside the highest socioeconomic decile. And here, only here, for all the lots of the richest decile, the homeownership rate becomes important. So only in those richest neighborhoods, the rate of homeownership is associated with freezing the floor area ratio between 2003 and 2019. And final results, here we basically wanted to see, this is an hypothesis that's been thrown into the literature by Robert Ellickson, and he basically argues, by David Schleicher, but he basically argues that when there are comprehensive plans, but in big zoning changes, the industry can counteract the influence of homeowners. So we restrict our sample to all lots that are part of a rezoning change that cover a surface, it says survey, that's a mistake, a surface above median. And we observe, although it's less statistically significant, the same statistical result, right? So the results hold in more comprehensive zoning changes, although it's less robust from a statistical point of view, and we need to see whether this is because we are restricting too much the sample. We need to look a little bit in more detail about what's going on here. So in summary, we are seeing in our study that the high rate of affluent residents in urban neighborhoods is associated with lower probability of upzoning. Unlike previous literature, the presence of homeowners is not associated with lower probability of upzoning, except in high income areas. Results hold when controlling for accessibility to jobs. Same sign, but less robust results when analysis center on big zoning changes. So we are seeing, again, important externalities of an institutional regime that favors local land use controls. And this seems to be a story more related to urban inequality than a story about the influence of homeownership, which has been the main argument provided by the previous literature. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. That's fascinating. Yeah, I think the result there you have with homeownership builds on this initial motivation of the importance of context and the importance of doing these kinds of studies outside of the United States, especially. And in much of the world, being a homeowner, like the classification of homeowner is not the same as it is in the United States, right? So in a lot of Latin America, there are 80% homeownership rate, but some of them are very wealthy mansion owners, and some of them are very low income owners, without full legal claim even to the property, but still classified as homeowners. So I think that distinction between home voter hypothesis, but only the rich home voters that are expecting to see appreciation from their property, right? I'm thinking about being politically active locally in order to protect the value of their asset, right? That's not necessarily something that's happening in every neighborhood. I have a bunch of questions. We can take questions from the audience.
Yeah, I don't know if
I have a bunch of questions though, so I'm just going to start. I got the mic. Yeah, so one question was, I mean, maybe you could just tell us a little bit about the politics. I mean, so my impression of Santiago is that, and the map you showed of the places where there were zoning changes reflects the fact that there have been a lot of zoning changes compared to a place like Los Angeles. Like, so CJ Gabby's dissertation, it was a bit similar, focused on LA. You know, I think like 1% of lots in Los Angeles or something had received any kind of zoning change over the time period. I think it was a decade or something that he studied. So there has been a lot of activity of zoning reform in the different municipalities of Santiago. Maybe you could just tell us a little bit about like the politics generally. Is there always opposition to it? It seems like there's enough upzoning happening that there's at least some political constituency supporting it, right?
Yeah, I think, well, I think, and that's also connected to what Alfonso asked in the chat, whether there's also, where these are discretionary changes, where there's any indicator of corruption, which I think is also related to the political economy of these changes, right? And yeah, we don't want to we don't want to sort of provide the argument that, offer the argument that this is like homeownership is the main political act, homeowners are the main political act, sorry, high income residents are the main political actor in zoning changes and in urban politics in Santiago. Because we are only observing that in certain neighborhoods where there's a high presence of high income residents, there's this link, this association between their presence and land use regulations that become stricter over time, or they're frozen over time. In most part of the cities, as we see from the map, there has been a lot of changes, as Pablo was mentioning, actually. Probably many of those changes have been heavily influenced by the real estate industry. So this is not a study that measures like a causal relationship between these factors. But if I can provide an hypothesis, I would say that the real estate industry is still an important actor, an important driver of urban politics. But over time, it seems that in some neighborhoods, residents have been able to organize in order to counteract the influence and to protect those neighborhoods and the characteristics of those neighborhoods, especially when there's a high presence of single-family housing. There are no buildings, and this is more anecdotal information, but what I see, for instance, in the municipality where I live, is that there was a huge change. There were many changes in the zoning plans. Then that led to the construction of many buildings, which in turn led to more community organization and residents that started to oppose the construction of new housing, right? So in high income areas, after what they have seen in other parts of the city, with very flexible land use rules, with some instances of corruption, as Alfonso was asking, they react opposing the construction of buildings, etc. So like I would say that we could predict that now actually in many, like this is sort of disseminating throughout the city, and we have like places that are very close, let's say, to a subway station, where the heights and the regulations are very, very strict. So we understand, of course, that from a normative perspective, there has to be a balance between different densities, different heights, different floor ratio. But the fact that for many years the real estate industry had a very favorable environment that led to the construction of very high-rise projects, led to the organization of many residents in some areas of the city that are opposing when the city is claiming for more affordable housing prices. So today, like, you cannot apply the government subsidy in almost every part of the city of Santiago because prices are so high, right? So yeah, there's been a trend going back and forth from different drivers of urban politics, and I think that explains a little bit the outcomes.
That's fascinating, and it resonates very much with what I've seen in Mexico City, for example, where you do have, unlike the United States, you do have high-income neighborhoods where there is a lot of redevelopment happening. You have neighbors that are opposing that redevelopment, but kind of the lobby of the developers is stronger than the lobby of the neighbors, and it keeps on happening. And I think that's surprising for people from the US because so little development happens in the kind of high-income neighborhoods that are opposing development here. But yeah, it is the local control over the regulation is less strong, I guess. Fernan, I have a couple more questions, but Fernan, would you like to ask a question? Nice to meet you, by the way.
Thank you, Pablo.
Friend.
Thank you, Pablo. So Diego, I think this is really fascinating. This is not my area, of course. By the way, I'm on the UCLA faculty, but I'm at the law school. I do corporate law, so this is completely unrelated to what I do. But again, I think this is fascinating. So Diego, I have a few questions about the estimations. I was curious about some of the things that you did. Like, for example, you don't show us much of what's going on for the main variable of interest, the one that shows whether you're basically rich or not. You only show us the effect of being in the top decile of the distribution, right? So I was wondering what's going on in the rest of the distribution. Is that variable, for example, like 1 for the top decile of the distribution and 0 for the rest, or are you controlling for the rest of the gaps of the brackets in the distribution, and then you're just not showing us what's going on there? That's one question. I also was curious about how you coded the dependent variable. I was wondering, why is it that you didn't do, like, for example, 1 for downzoning, 2 for upzoning, and 0 for no rezoning? Maybe it's just because it doesn't make sense, and I don't know the specifics of that. But I was curious why this is not, for example, a multinomial logit or an ordinal logit in which you just examine what's going on at different levels. You just build like 2 different dichotomous variables, but I didn't see any explanation of that. I also wanted to ask you how you ran the model, because one thing well, I felt that it was the results were significant at the 5% level, but you have a huge data set. So I was wondering whether the results are robust across a number of specifications. For example, if this was OLS, is this sensitive to running it as a logit, as a probit, etc.? So I wonder whether you can say a little bit about the robustness of the test, and especially because again, the main result was significant at 5% with a huge data set. So that got me thinking a little bit. And this is the final point that I wanted to ask you, is related to what Pablo was mentioning, or it's tangentially related to that point, which is how do you define home ownership exactly? Because I understand, for example, that it's not the same, even if you're not a homeowner, it's not the same if you're a financial institution that is renting property in a location. You're gonna the effect of having a financial institutions renting is going to be different from, for example, having natural persons renting, and I understand there is a lot of debate here in the U.S. Because of that. There is a lot of opposition from homeowners. I understand a lot of opposition to financial institutions buying like big lots of or a big number of properties and then renting them, because that's apparently that increases the price of the properties, etc., and has other effects that don't show up when you just have natural individuals buying and then renting. So I wonder whether that plays any role in your analysis. I'm sorry for throwing you so many questions, but I need to leave in a few minutes, so I wanted to take the chance to learn a bit about that. Thank you, Diego.
Thank you very much. Fernand's questions remember me our doctoral seminar at Stanford, where always Fernand asked the complicated statistical questions to all of us that were struggling with our doctoral dissertations. Okay, so with regard to the first question, yeah, we presented our preferred specifications. We have run several tests and other analysis. So we have also run the regression with income level as a continuous variable to explore the different results. More or less, it shows, if I remember well, Andrea or Hugo or Javier can complement it, but I think it also showing the same direction. But in social inequality studies, there has been a trend towards sort of separating sort of the income distribution effects in, let's say, the first decile, the richer decile versus the rest. And that's actually very, there's also sociological economic literature in Chile, for instance, showing that the social and economic dynamics of the richest decile are very different from the rest, right? So there's also a support in saying that this is, I think the finding is illustrated better if we can find that association, because, for instance, we see that there's a lot of social mobility in Chile, except for the richest decile. No one gets in the richest decile, no one gets out. That's sort of the research of Florencia Torche, this sociology professor at Stanford. So, so I think we also wanted to sort of debate and make our study in dialogue with that social mobility literature, and also all these inequality studies that are showing that this distribution or the effects of the richest or the dynamics behind the life of the richest are very different from the rest. Now if we want, we also observe that even in those in outside where, because in our sample there are some districts that are heavily populated by the richest decile, but even in neighborhoods outside the eastern income where there's high presence of them, that we are observing the same result. But we need to show in the paper all the rest of the analysis that Fernand was suggesting, because I think they all point into the same direction. With respect to how we coded the dependent variable, well, there it's interesting what you're saying. We basically follow the literature because we thought that upzoning and downzoning are different outcomes that we didn't want to sort of show in the same regression. That's why we basically separated our regressions in these two models, one for upzoning and one for downzoning. Basically because we're following what others have done in the same area, but I think we need to think a little bit more about that. Maybe, I don't know if Hugo or Andrea.
I feel like I forgot exactly. I feel like I might have pressured CJ to do an ordered logic where the first regression is on did anything change, and then the second one is on did it go up or down. I mean, that might be one way to think about it, like no change versus change, and then if there's a change, is it up or down? but yeah, I mean, I kind of tend to agree with you that they are different enough outcomes that
we had regressions where it was 1 if there was an upzoning or downzoning, and 0.
Yeah, that doesn't seem right. Yeah.
Yeah, and 0 if, well, no, or either upzoning or downzoning, and 0 if so we didn't include in the 0 those places where there was no change. And we also thought it was wrong, right? Because if there was no change, there's something that is going on there as well. So that's why we basically decided to, because we had that regression for the whole municipalities, and then we decided to restrict that to all developed. Because if you include in your sample only all developed lots, if there's no change, means something. There's something going on. There's basically they're freezing the zoning. That's sort of the logic. But I don't know if I'm responding well.
I wanted to add on a model question that I think might be a suggestion and a question. I think so. The question: did you have a municipal fixed effect or like a municipal dummy variable? Because it seems like the municipal level is the one making the decision. So that's a pretty important thing to consider. And I noticed in that map, it seemed like there were 1 or 2 municipalities where the whole municipality was dark blue. And so I think that's like a very different political process happening in that municipality versus a place where, and this is sort of was a question earlier also about the discretionary spot zoning, and you highlighted the difference between spot zoning, like a few parcels changing versus like a broad change across the whole municipality. So, I mean, I think at least including a fixed effect would be a good idea. And then potentially, you know, you have a lot of observations, so you could do different models for separate municipalities if you think like the process is happening in a different way in different municipalities.
Yeah. Well, the fixed effect issue, we have dealt heavily on that question actually, because we have included the fixed effects, but basically all our results fade away, and the main reason is that we have very homogeneous municipalities in Chile. Right. So there's no enough variation in the data. Right. And that says something. Like we learned that basically using the fixed effects, and that's something we disclaim in the paper that we're writing. What happens is basically that the high income neighborhoods are heavily concentrated in one part of the city. Right. We are seeing the same pattern all over that city. We're also seeing a little bit of that when in those very in some of these neighborhoods that are also that are heavily populated by high income residents outside the eastern cone. But there's no enough variation among municipalities to an income.
And did you try? So within the municipalities that do have, because it did seem like there were some municipalities where the zoning was going up and down. Yeah. Did you try to do separate models for separate municipalities? Because then you could just say, okay, here's a bunch that didn't really change much. We kind of ignore those for now, or do a municipal level description of here's 3 that they all downzoned and 3 that didn't change anything and 3 that were, you know, had a lot of variety within the municipality. And for the ones with the variety, then that's where you would get some results in the regression.
Yeah. I think I don't know if Andrea and Hugo can say something about it, but I think we ran the same regression for the whole sample, excluding the highest decile districts, municipalities. And I think we found the same sign, but it's not as robust statistically as it's not statistically significant, probably because of the sample is very restricted. Yeah.
Also, Diego, did you try maybe random effects? Because in that case, you don't have, I mean, it's going to absorb less the effect of things that are constant over time. So maybe you can try that to see what happens.
No, that's a good idea. We haven't tried that, I think. Yeah.
Come to a seminar and get a lot of homework.
Yeah.
I mean, my other questions are just more things I'd like to know about the, you know, how if we tried like how big of a change rather than just any upzoning as a 1, you know, levels of upzoning, right? So was it a 0.5 increase? Is it a 1 increase? Is it above 1? And then with the periods of time, I mean, 16 years and a global financial crisis in the middle there is a pretty long time. I don't know if you thought about chunking the time periods in some way.
Yeah. We actually run the regression with for shorter periods of time, but then we were not able to capture as much observations as we would like to. So also the results were less robust and the errors were higher. But we can of course shorten the period, right?
Was there a period where there were a lot of changes happening, or were the zoning changes happening pretty regularly throughout that 16 years?
That's a good question, Andrea. Do you have the answer? I don't remember the years.
The first 5-7 years, there's low activity, and from 2007 onwards, there's a little bit more activity in all municipalities, but but the size and difference, they're very different modifications.
Yeah, and now I remember the reason why we are using this long period of time, which is basically that we had a problem with the census of 2012, right? So the reliable data that where we can get information about income distribution and home ownership rates is from the 2002 census. So basically, ideally, we would use the 2012 and then see this period of high regulatory changes activity, right? But given that most of the regulatory activity occurred in the last decade, and the reliable data that we have on income distribution and home ownership comes from 2002, we decided to control for this baseline, seeing the whole period of time, basically. Home ownership, Fernan, is calculated. It doesn't refer to whether the actual unit is owned by any institution. We are actually, from the census of 2002, we know whether in the lot, even it's a single family housing or it's an apartment building, we know whether there are renters or homeowners actually living there. That's what's asked in the census. So it's real data about home ownership status.
That makes sense. Yeah, my point is just that when you have renters, you have heterogeneity in the or you can have different types of renters basically, and that apparently can have an effect on many things. And this is just based on my informal reading of the news, that apparently when you have financial institutions buying and re-renting, homeowners don't like that because it has a number of effects that homeowners don't like. So yeah, that was basically my point, but that makes sense. Just going back quickly on the period, I agree with you that using the whole time frame makes sense, but maybe you can include year fixed effects because otherwise you're also losing part of the variance, but that's a way to account for time differences. And apparently they make sense because based on what Andrea was mentioning, you actually seem to have important differences in the period. So it makes sense to control for within period variation to see if there is any effect there.
That's a good idea. That's a good idea. Yeah.
Wonderful. I see one more question in the chat.
Yeah, Paulo is asking whether we have any sort of qualitative informed hypothesis about what happens in terms of collective action in high socioeconomic level areas, something like case studies. I ask because it seems to me that they could present an important difference compared to the collective action of low-income communities. Yeah, so why in high-income areas they're able to organize and influence, if that's the reason, if that's the mechanism, influence these land use decisions, right? that's a good question. We've been thinking about whether we could test some mechanisms in order to shed light, to say something more of just saying, well, high income people usually are more powerful or have more influence than the rest of the population, right? Yeah, but I'm not sure whether we can offer something except for general observations we can make. We know, for instance, that in high income areas there's a lot of organizations, also people that are very influential. Chile, well, that's also part of the problem of the fixed effect, that Santiago is a very segregated city, and it's especially segregated in the richest zone, right? So high income areas are very homogeneous, right? And probably even the directors and the board of the of the building industry live in these areas, right? So the connection between the political and the economic power it's a very sort of linked, connected. It's heavily related. So it's not. I don't think it's difficult for someone that lives in a high income area to sort of approach decision makers and try to influence what they're doing. Now, also there in high income areas, there are not a strong incentives for local municipalities to actually relax the rules in order to offer higher supply of housing, right? They're basically doing well. They provide good services. A lot of people want to live there, so there's no actually a very strong political nor economic incentive to promote higher supply of housing. So I think it's reasonable that they're not going to make decisions that are going to alter significantly the neighborhood characteristics of their communities.
Yeah, that all makes a lot of sense. And I think, so on the qualitative study side of things, I think what would be really interesting would be to look at the higher income neighborhoods where they haven't been successful in downzoning or resisting upzoning, right? Because those are the cases where, right? I mean, the prior is that they're going to organize, and because they're powerful and have time and connections, they're going to be successful in manipulating the rules. But that doesn't always, if it doesn't happen, right? That's the interesting case. And the point about segregation levels increasing with neighborhood income, I think is extremely important. People think about segregation, I think influenced by US literature and US experience, right? People think about segregation if you think about the concentration of poverty, when in fact, in most of the world, the people that live in homogeneous neighborhoods are rich people, usually not. Cool. Well, this was a fantastic talk. I really appreciate you bringing it to this seminar, and thank you again. Thanks for everyone for attending.
Thanks everyone. Yeah, that's great. We would love to also compare our results with other Latin American urban contexts. So if anyone has a reference or a paper that I'd like to share with us, that would be really nice, because most of our reference comes from the US data and studies. So we'd love to sort of connect better with other studies that are being done in Latin American cities.
That's great. Yeah. Have you talked to Cynthia Goitia in Argentina? She's doing a big survey of land use regulation. So.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
All right. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
I'm going to stop the recording.